Hey everybody, welcome on our channel. In this video we are gonna see, what if Naruto was the son of the Tenzin and got harem? Part 1. Huge shout out to Helghy for this story. If you are new on the channel, don't forget to subscribe our channel and like the video too. So without wasting any more time, let's start the story. A violent storm raged over Republic City. More precisely, it raged over a singular rooftop at the heart of downtown. Police headquarters seemed to be the epicenter of a small but incredibly powerful storm brewing above it. At least to the average citizen. The truth was far more interesting than simply odd weather patterns. On the roof of the city's Center for Law and Order, a single airbender, one of only a handful left in the world and eldest grandson of the previous Avatar himself, ripped apart the sky with a ferocity not natural to the peaceful air nomad culture. At least not to the traditional air nomad culture. Nothing about Naruto was traditional though. He was, and would always be, a bit of a black, or maybe better yet, golden sheep. Even among his own kind. Especially among his own kind. The young man thrust a hand forward as if jabbing at an invisible opponent's eye, and a thin hole drilled through the head of a practice dummy across from him. A flick of his wrist backward, then a violent slash with the same hand, and suddenly the head of the dummy was sliced cleanly off of its shoulders. Around him a half-dozen other dummies lay in similar states of destruction. The blonde looked over his newest faux and hummed faintly. The voice of his father for his more destructive tendencies echoing in his ears despite the man being nowhere near him. "That is not our way, Naruto." He could hear the condescending tone even now. "That's not your way. Fossil." He growled before hitting the dummy's head with a gust of wind to bounce it up into his hands. "I hope Lin isn't too mad that I wrecked another set of dummies. It's hard to tell what will set her off sometimes." Naruto idly spoke to himself as he inspected the hole drilled through the dummy's head. After deciding that he had done enough training for the day, Naruto quickly cleaned up. Wedging the remains of the practice dummies behind the rooftop toolshed, Naruto made his way downstairs just in time to catch a very tense and frustrated-looking Lin storming out of her office and toward the motor pool. Probably leave bringing up the rooftop training equipment for later. I wonder what's on her mind. He mumbled as he jogged to catch up to the woman. The blonde airbender was pretty pleased that her steely eyes and tense stature softened ever so slightly when she caught sight of him. Still, she was far too pent up for his liking. Lin Bifrung's temper was like a volcano. It built and built and built pressure until it exploded and burned everyone indiscriminately. It had sort of fallen to Naruto over the last couple of years to defuse the ticking time bomb that was Republic City's chief of police before she lost it in the middle of headquarters or something. Thankfully, Naruto had a couple advantages on that front that nobody else did. With a flick of his wrist as he silently walked beside her, a small cool breeze blew across the back of Lin's neck, making the woman shiver before she shot a look at Naruto. The younger man simply looked a picture of innocence as he smiled warmly back at her. "Not right now, Naruto," she said as they came to her Satomobile. "Not what right now, Lin?" Naruto asked innocently as he spun his fingers and another cool breeze slid across her skin. This time across the upper portion of her calves. "Just get in or you can walk home," she grumbled as she fought down another shiver. The brat knew all her most sensitive spots. It wasn't fair. "Alright," he said, though the grin on his face only broadened as a sudden gust caused her hair to tickle at her neck, once again forcing another slight shiver out of the woman. Lin clicked her tongue at Naruto as she quickly bent the armored portions of her uniform off, leaving her in a snug skirt that showed off her athletic and curvaceous body. One that women even half her age would kill for. After she stowed her armor in the back of the vehicle, Lin started making her way up to the driver's side again, only for yet another small gust to flip her skirt up, exposing rather racy lacy black underwear and garters. The police chief immediately flushed bright red and tried to glare at the boy as he grinned back at her. "Naruto?" She hissed at him while looking frantically all around them to make sure none was there. Thankfully, she and the airbender were the only ones present in the expansive garage at the moment. "Relax, Lin. You think I'd let anyone else see you like that? I'm a lot more private than Tenzin," Naruto said as he stepped up beside her again. "Now why are you so tense?" he asked. She seemed hesitant to say, instead pulling away toward the Satomobile. Naruto caught her arm and brought her back toward him. Raising an eyebrow, Lin couldn't help but be reminded of his father. She liked it far more on Naruto's face than his insufferable father. She also knew better to mention the similarities between Naruto and Tenzin to either man. She didn't want to discuss things that she knew would just anger both of them, so instead she leaned in and kissed the man young enough to be her son. Naruto happily responded by wrapping his tattooed arms around her and pulling her tightly to him. Sadly for the young airbending master, the kiss ended before they could grow too heated. He let his disappointment show, and Lin simply rolled her eyes as she climbed into the driver's seat and motioned for him to get in. Naruto could only sigh. Lin could be like stone, and while he was wind and he could wear her down. Sometimes it was best to just go with what she wanted. She was stubborn. But that was part of what made her Lin. Naruto and Lin swapped stories of their day on the way home. Naruto carefully leaving out the fact they needed more dummies and Lin obviously keeping something to herself as well. Naruto didn't pry though. He knew he'd get it out of her back at the manor house. The Satomobile moved from downtown to uptown and across the river slowly, thanks to the heavy evening traffic of Republic City. Gradually the buildings shifted to older designs and much wealthier-looking neighborhoods. Passing through Unity, one of the founding neighborhoods of Republic City, they finally came to the Bifrong Manor. Even after pulling in and parking, neither pushed into the topic that still loomed over them. They cooked together making a protein-heavy meal, something that Naruto especially enjoyed knowing his father had been a vegetarian for decades. Lin also preferred Naruto to eat meat-heavy meals. He had already filled out far better than his thin and lanky father. Finally, after eating and sitting on the couch in Lin's den, or more like leaning heavily into an embrace, Naruto's patience ran out. "So what did you so worked up earlier anyway? You know you'll feel better if you get it off your chest," Naruto said as he readjusted his grip around the woman's waist. Lin was silent for a bit. Long enough that Naruto nearly asked again. His third try would be to start teasing her sensitive neck with his lips, rather than the wind. "I saw Tenzin today." Lin withheld the grimace at Naruto tensing slightly and thereby tightening his grip of her. He relaxed soon afterward, letting her return to comfort. "What did he want to talk about?" "Police business hopefully," Naruto said. He hated when Tenzin got the odd paternal need to check in on Naruto. It was always followed by a condescending rant and being told how Naruto was disappointing his grandfather and letting down his memory. It was worse when he brought up Naruto's mom and siblings though. That was a line that when crossed led to a shouting match every time. "Kind of. Nothing to do with you or really me I guess," she answered. "Really? What is it then? The equalists movement?" he asked again. "No, not this time," she said again, enjoying the feeling of his voice rumbling in his chest. Naruto didn't have an especially deep voice. More raspy, but he was coming toward the end of puberty and he did have a man's voice that Lin found pleasant to hear. Naruto hummed. He knew Lin had her own bad blood with his father. It was part of the reason Naruto had come to live with her nearly 8 years ago after earning his master's tattoos for airbending. He couldn't bear to live under Tenzin anymore and Lin had once been engaged to the man and knew better than most how he was. So Lin had taken him in as a good godmother was supposed to do. 2 years ago though, the relationship had taken a different turn. "Let's forget about him. Let's forget about everything for a little while Lin," Naruto said with a husky tone as he began kissing at her neck. She always felt guilt about their relationship ever since that moment of weakness 2 years ago led to this new status, couldn't give Naruto a family. Something she knew was extremely important to him. She couldn't be his wife or give him sons and daughters to rebuild the air nomads. Still she never ended it. She couldn't not when they both took such relief and pleasure in one another. Her mind turned away from her guilt at the situation as Naruto's skilled hand slipped up along her thigh before finding the thin barrier of her underwear covering her womanhood. By now his kissing, licking, and sucking at her tender spots had reached a fevered pitch and Lin's mind became somewhat fogged with lust and passion. The worries of the day, of Tenzin's holier-than-thou attitude and the new avatar's arrival, slipped fully from her kind as she threw herself into the moment with her lover. Lemon happened. As if one being. So they grinded into one another. Still it was enough. Both were even more sensitive than before and not long after making it to the bedroom they came again. More of their mixed juices spilling out and down their thighs as they simply held one another, leaving Naruto buried within Lin. It took some time but eventually both detached from one another. They cleaned up in the bathroom and changed into a new set of clean clothing before returning to their position on the comfortable couch in the den. They simply enjoyed the silence for a while, but Lin knew she had best tell Naruto exactly what had made her so on edge earlier. Now that both were so much more relaxed she could probably talk about Tenzin without getting huffy, as Naruto dubbed her mood when discussing his father. "Naruto, you wanted to know what Tenzin had to talk to me about today," she began. She turned to face him seeing she had his attention. "If you want to just forget whatever bullshit he was offloading on you Lin, it's fine," Naruto replied leaning forward for a small kiss. As they broke the kiss the elder woman shook her head. "They did need to discuss it. The Avatar evidently stowed away on a ship to follow your father up here," she explained. "What? Why? I thought he was going to the South Pole to teach her to airbend," Naruto replied. "He said some crap about the equalists needing his focus. I guess he told her he doesn't have time to train her," Lin said. "Doesn't have time? Freaking arrogant fass. She's the Avatar. How self-entitled do you have to be? Not to mention what does he even really do here but maybe vote once a month. Maybe," Naruto complained. He gently pushed Lin off of him and stood up. "So he probably plans on sending her back huh?" Naruto said a little disappointed he probably missed his chance to meet the Avatar. He was probably just a few floors above her if he had the right timeline for when Lin dealt with his father in the Avatar. She seems like a punk, then again she's probably someone you'd get along with way too well. Lin had a small smile. There were plenty of similarities she could already see from her brief meeting with the Avatar earlier. The girl was rebellious and pragmatic. Just like her Naruto. Really? Tenzin, the killjoy strikes again. He grumbled. Lin looked over at her lover and a thought slid across her mind. One of Naruto building a family and a life for himself. The guilt chased away during their lovemaking was back full force as she could practically feel herself weighing him down. He needed to spend time with people his own age. Girls his own age. She's probably still here. I can't imagine even Tenzin being able to resist both of you if you convince him to let her stay. Lin said, though something in her ached to encourage him to meet the young Avatar. Really? You think so? Naruto asked. I don't doubt it. You'll have to take your glider probably. No more fairies tonight. She explained. She made her way to the small home bar she had and poured a glass of wine, getting a confused look from Naruto. She cursed a little mentally at that. He was an empathetic man. Compassionate despite what his father believed. Tell Pima and the kids hi from me, please. Tell Tenzin to drop dead. She said, shooting him a reassuring smile. He hesitated briefly. He could tell something was bothering her. She was stubborn though. He wouldn't get it from her tonight, and if he hung around he would miss the Avatar. Shooting a grin her way and sped over and gave her an extra wet and sloppy kiss, causing her to growl at him and call him an ass as he left cackling up the stairs toward the roof. Korra felt like the whole trip had been a waste as she walked down the dock with Tenzin and his 3 children. And Naga too, of course. The kids clung to her and said their goodbyes sadly. All the while Tenzin watched on with his face slowly softening as he watched his children interact with the Avatar. His father's reincarnation. Just as he was about to call to Korra and tell her he had changed his mind and that she could stay, he caught sight of glider circle overhead. Naruto. Tenzin said quietly with a groan. He didn't want to deal with his rebellious son today. Especially around Korra. He already foresaw that disaster happening. Naruto. Ikki and Milo cheered loudly, waving up at the blonde, causing to make a sharp dive before suddenly landing before the gathered airbenders and Avatar. Kids. Naruto cheered equally loudly to their earlier cry. He swept both of them and the more reserved and now blushing Jinora up with a gust of wind right into his arms, wrapping them tightly into a hug. Naruto laughed as his youngest siblings giggled loudly and even Jinora smiled at the warm embrace from her big brother. Korra meanwhile stood nearby, completely shocked at the sight of another airbender. He was tall, likely a few years older than her own 17 years, and clearly very fit from the snug orange and gold robes he wore. His hair was short and wild and colored bright blonde like a sunflower or perhaps even the sun itself. His eyes were bright blue and held a lot of cheer as he pulled his brother and sisters in tight. The last thing Korra noticed, besides the fact that in facial structure he was very obviously the elder sibling to the 3 kids, was the bright blue arrows tattooed on his forehead and arms, likely on his legs as well. Slightly different than Tenzin's own, the trail of blue lines leading to the arrowheads had spiraling designs that she could remember seeing in the Air Nomad banner on the temple and on the statue of Avatar Aang's staff. Who are you? She blurted out without thinking, hearing a sigh come from somewhere behind her, Tenzin's direction, though she paid no mind to it. Oh me? I'm Naruto, I'm these munchkins' big brother. He said with a smile while offering his hand. Wah, but Tenzin never said anything about you. Korra blurted again, none of those in the conversation, noticing the slightly pained look past Tenzin's face at her words. Jinora though bit her lip and glared at the ground, while Milo and Ikki just continued rubbing themselves deeper into their brother's arms. Yeah, not really surprised there. Tenzin has trouble owning up to his mistakes. Right, old man. Lin says drop dead by the way, oh and hi to mom and the kids. Naruto said as he shook Korra's hand. Tenzin huffed, causing a small gust that flourished his robes as he approached Korra. He did his best to simply ignore Naruto, stepping past him to stand before Korra. The young Avatar quickly noticed the byplay and grew a little worried. Glancing at Jinora, she could tell the girl was biting back tears at the way her father acted, and she couldn't help but be a bit shocked herself at how he treated his eldest son. Not to mention the fact that this was the first time she even heard of him. Whatever happened there she wanted to know, but it would have to wait as Tenzin clearly had his mind made up to say something important. Korra, I have done my best to guide Republic City toward the dream my father had for it. It's fallen out of balance since he passed. I thought I should put off your training in order to uphold his legacy, but you are his legacy. Tenzin said as he placed a hand on Korra's shoulder, getting a stunned look, not only from her, but from Naruto and Jinora as well. Silently Naruto couldn't believe what he was seeing. His father, Tenzin, admitting not only to being wrong but essentially asking for help. Then the confusion took a bitter turn as he realized what was really going on. There was only one person that Tenzin deferred to. His own father. It seemed even after reincarnation he continued to do so. Naruto didn't blame Korra, and he was at least happy his father wasn't so full of himself that he thought himself to be above teaching the Avatar. Still his words they burned at Naruto, and he couldn't help the frustration in his heart as he thought of his own time learning under his father. Inora seemed to know he was bothered as her hand slipped into his own, causing him to look down at the eldest of his younger siblings and smile. A long-used method of the air nomads was to take calming breaths and release your aggression and frustration. It was usually far easier said than done, but Naruto was the youngest airbending master outside of his Avatar grandfather. So he released his turmoil with a wind and focused back on Tenzin and Korra. You may stay here and train airbending here, with me. Tenzin continued, causing Korra's face to brighten up, her jaw practically unhinging at the massive intake of breath in preparation for a shout of joy. Republic City needs its Avatar once again. Tenzin finished as she shouted a victorious yes while pumping her fists. Thank you, you're the best. Korra said, wrapping the man in a hug that caused him to startle slightly. Yeah, it's really unlike you. Come on kids, let's race up to the temple and tell mom the good news. Naruto said, getting cheers from the children who shot off as he laughed. See you up at the house, Avatar Korra. We should properly get to know one another sometime since you'll be hanging around my family and all. Naruto said as he kept pace with the kids, though still letting them win. Tenzin eyed his son as he left and caught Korra by the arm before she could follow suit. He sighed as she turned to look at him, and he kept his eyes focused on the forms of his children as they distanced themselves from himself and Korra. He needed to make sure she was aware of some things before she settled in to live in Republic City, and one of the biggest and most complicated issues had just been introduced to her. Korra, before you settle in you need to know some things. Ground rules. Tenzin said, getting her attention. Number 1, stay away from Naruto. He said with the gravest tone he could muster. What? She asked, shocked by not only his change in demeanor, but by what he was telling her. Stay away from my eldest son. He would be a bad influence on you. He is violent and deadly. Extremely so. Tenzin pressed on. Whoa, Tenzin. That's your son, right? He can't be that bad. Korra argued. The older boy had seemed nice enough and clearly loved his siblings dearly. There was an obvious issue between him and Tenzin though. Yes, he is my son, but have you ever been told the story about Zuko and Azula by my mother? Tenzin asked. Confused, Korra slowly nodded her head. Good, well Naruto is most similar to Azula. A natural prodigy at bending, he even develops his own move sets. He earned his master's tattoos at such an early age that only my father outdid him. However, maybe it was because of that skill, but he has started down a darker path. One that I cannot allow to influence you. He explained. What does that mean, a darker path, exactly? She was a bit fearful and curious about Naruto now. Tenzin was so determined to make sure she didn't interact with him, it felt so surreal. Just follow the rule, Korra. He demanded before looking up to the setting sun. We'll discuss more about the rules I expect you to follow and how we will organize your training tomorrow. Plus we'll need to start planning a public statement. Head on up or you'll miss dinner. Korra looked as if she wanted to argue, but seeing the expression on the man's face, she complied and headed up to the temple to eat with the airbending family. Including the one she was to evidently avoid. Where did I go wrong with him, father? Why can't he be more like you would want him to be? Tenzin asked the wind. Flashback. Tenzin hadn't slept a full night in weeks. His son, his precious child with Pima, was slipping away and there was nothing he could do about it. Every day he grew weaker and weaker. The 3-year-old didn't even cry anymore. Simply curled inward in pain as his body failed to properly operate. Such agony wasn't meant for an innocent child. Especially his Naruto. His little boy. Tenzin, we have to ask your father. I know Avatar Aang is much weaker than he was now, age is catching up to him, but there must be something he can do. I can't lose my baby. Pima practically begged. The airbender, currently the only one in the world besides his elderly father, looked on his wife as she held their child close to her chest. The boy himself only murmured quietly before whimpering in pain. Pima went back to comforting the boy as soon as she heard it, and Tenzin felt his heartache to see his family suffer. Why? It wasn't fair. Why Naruto? He was a little boy who should be giggling and just learning about bending for the first time. I'll go see him now. Tenzin said as he stood. He wasn't sure there was really anything his father could do. Curing illness wasn't precisely within the Avatar's area of expertise. Still he had to try. The trip was short. Aang was currently visiting Lin. That would normally be awkward and enough to keep Tenzin away after he ruined his relationship with his former fiancée. Tonight though he'd deal with any discomfort from the woman if it meant he could ease his son's pain. Arriving at the house, Tenzin still grimaced at the sour look Lin gave him as she answered the door. She said nothing and simply walked away, letting the airbender slowly make his way into the house and look for his father within. It didn't take long. Aang had a favorite room within the Bifrong Manor and even a favorite seat within that favorite room. Tenzin. I hadn't thought you would come visit me here with you and Lin on the outs. I'm glad to see you though, my son. Aang said with a smile toward the younger man. Dad, I'm sorry, but I'm not here to visit. I need help. No, Naruto, my little boy needs your help, Dad. Tenzin said. He had hardly finished when the older man was already on his feet and headed for the door. Lin, we're going to the island. Something is wrong with Naruto. Aang called out as he walked down the hall. The earthbender stuck her head out from a room in shock. I'm coming too. She stated. There's really no need, Tenzin tried to argue. Drop dead, Tenzin, I'm coming. Lin said as she pushed past him. The trio headed out and climbed up on Appa before mushing the sky bison on toward the island, sitting just past the center of the bay. On the other side of the massive statue of Tenzin's father. Tell me what is wrong with him, Tenzin. Aang said as they flew over the waters of Republic City. He coughs and wheezes often and is exhausted at all times. He is cold as ice most of the time and Mother and the other water tribe healers can do nothing. It's a sickness none of them have encountered before. Tenzin said. Your mother told me a little about it but never told me it was serious. Then again, I've rarely seen her over the last couple of years. Aang released a weary sigh. The Avatar never truly got a moment to relax. Why didn't you come to me sooner? Aang asked. I went to my mother, she is the healer. Tenzin said weakly. Fair enough. Aang said as he nodded his head. Still, he felt there could be something he might be able to do. As they landed and the group headed inside, they soon found Pima and the sickly Naruto in the sitting room. The toddler was awake but his glassy eyes stared blankly at the new entrance. Aang frowned sadly at seeing his first grandchild in such a fashion. He is in pain? Aang asked, more to Pima than his son. All the time. It's like the pain has made him give up. She said in a rough whispering voice. She'd lost her voice from days on end crying at the looming end of her baby's life. Please, father. There has to be something you can do. Tenzin asked. Beside him, Lin had lost all of her former tough and aggressive demeanor. She couldn't bear the dead look in the little child's eyes, but she also couldn't bear to look away. Aang said nothing as he gently took the child from Pima's grasp. Tenzin wrapped his wife in his arms as the couple watched the Avatar and the baby's grandfather step away from them and slowly and gently check over the child. Hums of thought, clicks of the tongue, and the sound of air sucked between teeth were the only sounds in the room as he checked over practically every inch of the ill boy. I might be able to do something, but I will need to enter the Avatar state. I want you to stay here. Both of you need to relax as best you can. I'll come back in a moment with an idea, hopefully. Lin, come with me. I need you to watch over Naruto while I enter the spirit world. Aang said. He left no room for argument as he swept out the door and down the hall. Lin trailed behind him. Pima and Tenzin could only wait and hope. Pray for the sliver of a chance that something from that mystical realm would tell Aang how to save their child. It felt like an eternity waiting, but eventually the Avatar returned. His face grave but his eyes determined. I have a solution. It comes at a cost though, Tenzin. Aang said. Anything? The young father said as he stepped forward. You're far too serious, my son. Aang laughed. Dad, what do I have to do? Tenzin asked. Simply raise the boy to be a good man. Someone I would be proud of. The aged Avatar said as his eyes and tattoos began to glow with a white light. As if stars themselves burned within him. What? Tenzin managed to say before suddenly the light flashed blindingly bright and he and the two women were forced to shield their eyes. It only lasted a moment before the brightness faded, leaving the elderly Avatar holding his grandson and slowly lowering himself into the chair behind him. He smiled down at the now blonde boy and nearly laughed as he opened his bright blue eyes. Naruto was curiously grinning up at the old man that looked so much like his father. You will be something astounding one day, my little Naruto. Aang cooed at the boy before laughing as the child tugged lightly at his thin beard. Tenzin, Aang called as he felt the weariness from what he'd just done begin to creep up on him. You did it, Dad. You saved my little boy. Thank you. Tenzin cried as Pima scooped her son up out of Aang's arms and hugged him tightly, crying and laughing all the while. Of course, he is my grandson after all. Aang laughed before wheezing faintly. Tenzin, you must listen. The change in tone from his father's former joyful voice to his more serious tone had Tenzin focusing on his father's next and unknowingly final words. It took the Avatar some time to catch his breath. Already his body was surrendering itself to the consequences of his actions. Tenzin. Naruto's spirit was weakened and hurting. I bound the energy of another spirit to him to save his life and give him all he would need to live a long healthy life if you raise him well. I have faith in you. Aang explained. Yes, father. Tenzin said, his eyes widening as he saw his father slowly sagging into the chair. The time for me to pass on and reincarnate into the next Avatar in the cycle has come, my son. You will have to help both little Naruto and my future self to become strong capable people. Just remember to have faith in them. Aang rasped. With that, the Avatar Aang, airbender and savior of the world, passed on to his next reincarnation. A newborn girl of the Southern Water Tribe. Then flashback. Staring up at the temple and recalling how far he and his son had become estranged, Tenzin briefly wondered if it had been worth it. He cast the thought from his mind, instantly disgusted with himself. Naruto was his son. As much as both often pretended that not to be a fact, he was Tenzin's flesh and blood. He just wished he had succeeded when Aang had asked him to raise him well. Perhaps it was too late to reach Naruto and make him worthy of Aang's sacrifice, but the true legacy of the Avatar could still be molded in line with how his father dreamed. He just needed to make sure his mistakes didn't come back to bite him more than necessary when training Korra. Naruto's reunion with his siblings and mother had Korra immediately doubting Tenzin's opinion of the younger master. Seeing him tenderly hugging his mother and pressing a hand to her swollen belly like any excited elder sibling was about as wholesome as it got. Korra watched as he laughed as his youngest two siblings climbed up and down him like monkeys on a tree, and even Jinora had been pretty much glued to his side. That sadly changed when the whole family was seated in a single room together to eat. Dinner with the family of airbenders was a lot quieter than what Korra had expected. It was pretty easy to tell why though. Anytime Jinora or Ikki wanted to say something, they looked over at their father first before frowning and focusing on their meal. Naruto and Tenzin seemed to avoid looking at one another at all, while the younger master focused his attention on talking with his mother and little brother. That at least was nice to watch. It was obvious that Pima and Naruto were very close. The young man sat beside her and practically pampered his pregnant mother throughout the meal. Repeatedly hopping out of his seat to fill drinks for everyone, including his father and Korra. Korra herself had largely remained quiet. Something she wasn't really used to, but she had to admit being curious about the unknown airbender. Beyond the obvious bad blood he had with Tenzin, it seemed Naruto got along perfectly well with the rest of his family, and even the acolytes appeared happy to see him. That just made her wonder at Tenzin's warning earlier though. The idea that Naruto was evidently headed down some sort of dark path. She struggled to see it. If anything, it just seemed more like Naruto and his dad didn't get along. That was something she could relate to a bit. She'd fought with her own parents plenty, but it seemed like Naruto didn't even live at the Republic City Temple with the rest of his family. Korra, what do you think of Republic City so far? Naruto's voice pulled her from her thoughts, and she realized everyone was looking at her expectantly. The Water Tribe girl stammered, briefly glancing toward Tenzin, causing Naruto to frown a little and glance at his father as well. It didn't take much to figure out what had been said between them. Naruto turned back to Korra with a slightly more subdued smile. Let me guess, the old man told you not to interact with me or something? Naruto asked bluntly. Well, he didn't say that exactly. She replied, feeling a bit put on the spot. Oh, don't worry Avatar Korra, I don't hold it against you at all. Actually, if you can believe it, he told the exact same thing to each of my little siblings too, when I moved out. Well, he had to wait a few years for Milo cause he wasn't born when I left. Naruto was all smiles, but there was a hollow look in his eyes that set Korra on edge. I won't allow you to be a bad influence on them or on Korra. You are plenty welcome to return and be part of their lives, but it will be under my teachings. Tenzin lectured stiffly, only for him to be interrupted. Dinora, what do these tattoos mean? Naruto asked while tapping at the markings on his body. The 15-year-old stammered briefly before clearing her throat. They signify you as a fully fledged master with the right to advance the art of airbending and pass your teachings on to the next generation. That's exactly right. Naruto said, shooting Tenzin a look. The older airbending master had gone red in the face with anger. He stood to his feet and glared down at Naruto hotly. Those teachings, as you call them, are nothing more than violent teenage angst channeled into bending at the whim of a selfish child going through a rebellious phase. Tenzin shouted. Well, maybe if our people had a little more violent teenage angst to work with when grandfather was a kid, we wouldn't be the only airbenders in the world. Naruto hollered back, jabbing a finger out like he was stabbing a blade at his father. You do not want to bring your grandfather into this argument, boy. Tenzin's growled, jabbing his own finger back at the blonde. Enough. Both of you, that is enough. Really, in front of the children and a guest, the Avatar no less. Pima shouted, breaking up the fight. Naruto deflated immediately, sinking into his seat and apologizing to his mother. The woman clutched at her swollen belly, and her eyes softened as they locked with her son's. She had plenty of personal opinions about the argument, but she refused to pick a side. Still, her eyes flicked over to her husband with a bit of anger as he continued to stand and glare imperiously down at Naruto. Korra was stunned. She'd never seen Tenzin like this, and looking at his children now, she was worried. Milo looked frightened, while both Jinora and Ikki looked upset as well. Naruto looked upset and ashamed as well. The young Avatar took in everything around her and decided right then she would find a way to try and help the family mend things. It wasn't going to happen tonight though. She couldn't stifle the yawn that escaped her once more, making her the center of attention for the room. Thankfully both Ikki and Milo yawned after she did. Even Jinora did her best to snuff her own yawn out. It's getting late. We should all get around and ready for some sleep. Pima said. Naruto, sweetie, it's too late for you to head home, so I want you to stay the night. You can use your old room. Actually, I think it's best if Korra uses that room. She will be staying there, so might as well get her used to it. Tenzin said, getting a scowl from Pima at his words, making him grimace. He doubted he would stay in his own room tonight. I'll stay in one of the empty acolyte rooms, Mom. It's no big deal. Naruto said with a smile sent toward her. Pima sighed and nodded. Just promise you will be here in the morning for breakfast. She said, happy that her son nodded back. Alright, Ikki, Milo, time for bed. Jinora showed Korra to her room. Tenzin, please clean the dishes and the table. Pima said as she strolled past her husband with her two youngest by her side. Of course, darling. Tenzin said with a sigh as everyone left the room. Jinora did as she was told and led Korra to Naruto's room, snatching a couple notebooks off of the desk, mumbling something about leaving them there by accident. After she was gone, Korra took her time looking around the room. For the most part it was barren. Practically nothing beyond the essentials, and then a practical library of bending scrolls and guides. A smaller collection of spiritual texts lined a couple shelves as well. A knock at the door interrupted her browsing, and she stepped up to it expecting Tenzin or maybe Jinora or something. Instead, as she opened it, the tall blonde enigma she had just met earlier that night stood before her. Hello. He said with a smile, causing her to blink owlishly for a moment before her brain caught up. Hi. She replied. Sorry, were you about to go to sleep? Naruto asked. He would feel a little bad for pulling her out of bed, but now that his father was busy either getting a tongue lashing from his mother or sleeping in one of the spare rooms, it was the perfect opportunity to actually meet the Avatar. Nope, just looking around, I guess. Not much to look at though. I guess all your stuff was moved out when you left. Korra said. Naruto leaned forward and scanned the room. Korra moved out of the way and let him fully enter and take a good look. He hummed and ran a hand across the shelves holding his scrolls and books. With a shake of his head he turned and looked at Korra before shrugging. Looks exactly the same as I left it. All my stuff is here. Naruto said nonchalantly. What? There's nothing in here but a bed and some books. She said in shock. Yeah, you'll find out pretty quickly that Tenzin does not approve of anything that could be considered a distraction from training. When I was still learning to be an airbender, he usually didn't stop training till a long time after sunset. Didn't have much time to do much else in here besides sleep, Naruto explained. A bittersweet expression on his face. What was training with Tenzin like? Kinda wanna be prepared for it if I can be. Korra asked. Couldn't tell you. Thankfully his training regimen changed a lot from when he taught me. Naruto said as he started making his way back out of the room. Just be prepared to work hard. I'll see you at breakfast, Avatar Korra. Naruto said as he left. The door swung closed behind him with airbending. Yeah, good night. Korra replied. Her words were missing by the blonde just outside her room. Not because of him not hearing her, but because his mind was far away, stuck in a memory. Flashback. Again. A stern voice rang out and the 11-year-old climbed to his feet and took up a stance again. The hard wooden staff lashed out almost faster than he could see and cracked loudly against his side, causing him to cry out in pain and double over. The second blow he didn't see at all, he simply felt the pain on his back that dropped him to the ground. Again. The same stern voice called out, pulling the boy up once again. Naruto, the point of this exercise is to dodge blows from random directions. You aren't dodging at all. Tenzin said with a sigh. I know, Dad. Naruto began, only for a slightly lighter smack from the staff to hit his head. It's Master Tenzin while we are training. Now take your stance. You need to step up your work ethic if you ever want to measure up to your grandfather. Tenzin lectured. Naruto slid into a basic airbending stance and prepared himself. However, unlike the typical open-handed form he normally used, Naruto clenched his fists to try and help him suppress his anger at his father's words. As the staff came for him, yet again he could barely see it before it impacted his shoulder, causing pain to jolt through his arm and neck. Crying out in pain, he tried to twist around the next incoming strike, only to take the staff to the chest and then to the back, dropping him to the floor. A mix of pain and rage swirled in him, causing him to climb to his feet again without being commanded and taking his stance once more. Again his hands were closed tightly into fists. Again. Naruto said this time. Tenzin hesitated. He could tell his son had become frustrated. It was understandable. He had started having to cheat on this exercise about a week ago, after his son became practically untouchable. He used a little trick he had learned as a boy that let him reduce the wind resistance of the staff as he struck with it, making it even faster than was naturally possible. It also caused much more severe pain, but he knew Naruto could take it. His grandfather had placed his faith in Naruto's ability to surpass him, and so would Tenzin. Right now though, it was important his young son remain humble. So he prepared to strike him down for the final time of the day. As he swung though, Naruto pivoted out of the way of the strike, surprising Tenzin. The airbending master was proud of his son for a moment before the boy's hand lashed out and seized hold of the staff before grunting and causing the wood to splinter and crack before easily snapping in this grip. With another spin, the staff was suddenly tapping at Tenzin's neck. "Naruto!" Tenzin roared when he regained his composure at the display. "What? I beat the exercise. Shouldn't you be smiling or something?" The boy huffed out as he crossed his arms. "Smile, boy. You will go and meditate on why your actions were unbefitting of an airbender until I come to retrieve you." This staff was an heirloom from the Northern Air Temple. Tenzin shouted. Naruto seemed like he was about to apologize and do what was asked before his face hardened and he chuckled a broken piece of wood at his father's feet. He turned and began storming off, easily bending the air so that the 3 consecutive doors separating him from the outdoors were blasted open. "Whatever, every twig and rock around you is some shitty heirloom," he groused as he left. "Language? Wait till your mother hears of this," Tenzin shouted after him. "Oh? What is she gonna do, hit me with a stick too?" Naruto asked before airbending. The doors closed with a massive slam. Then flashback. "Naruto." A small voice caught his attention and Naruto looked up from the point where he had been staring while in memory to find Jinora. "Are you okay?" she asked, stepping out of her doorway and walking up to her big brother. "Yeah. Just fine. Remembering some stuff is all. What about you? I saw you yawning back at dinner, you must be tired," Naruto said gently as he placed a hand on the girl's shoulder. She smiled fondly up at him before wrapping him tightly in a hug. Jinora had always had a soft spot for her big brother. For her first 5 years of life they had been the only kids in the house after all. Even with his training from their father, he made time to play with her back then. They only grew closer as Naruto was made her primary teacher in bending to prepare him for his trials as a master. She missed spending time with him. In the last couple of years she hadn't gotten near as much time with him as she used to. Even when he moved out they still made time together, but recently it had become more and more rare. "I just missed you is all. I wanted to spend some time with you alone and thought this might be the only chance I would get for a while," she said as she pressed her face into his chest. The young man felt a sudden pang of guilt stab at him at her words. He remembered just the two of them. Him teaching her the basics of bending. Of hours spent together meditating to commune with spirits. Since he and Lin had started their romantic relationship, he had come back to the island less and less. His father got on his nerves more and more due to the things Naruto knew that made him angry. It wasn't fair to his mother and siblings though. He would make a change for them. "I'm so sorry, Jin. You know how I get sometimes. All broody," he said, drawing a small giggle from the girl. "You don't need to apologize," she said, but Naruto shook his head. "Yeah, I do. You mean a lot to me. So I promise to come visit more," Naruto said as he tightened the hug. Inora nodded into his chest and squeezed him back before they broke the embrace and she quickly slipped into her room. "Good night," she called out as she closed the door. "Good night," Naruto said before he started his own way to his temporary bed. He felt tiredness creeping up from the busy day he had. Sadly he wouldn't have Lin to curl up alongside tonight. The next morning breakfast was a bit subdued but far livelier than dinner had been the night before. The kids chattered and bugged Korra and occasionally Naruto with all sorts of questions. Tenzin for the most part remained quiet, though he did occasionally bring up that he would be meeting with the rest of the Republic City Council to set up a sort of press conference for Korra to announce her stay in the city. Naruto also said he couldn't stay long. They didn't need Lin thinking something had happened to him and having her metal benders tear the city apart looking for him. Still, Naruto made it clear he planned to come around more often, making Pima and the kids extremely happy, while Korra was definitely interested. Tenzin seemed indifferent, but at the conflicted look in his eyes, both Naruto and Pima knew he was happy and worried about such a thing. The fact that there was any happiness at all made Naruto pretty happy himself. Happy enough to be whistling a tune as he took to the skies with his glider and headed home. Hopefully Lin hadn't started gathering a search party for him or something. It didn't take long for him to reach the Bifrong Manor house. It sort of stuck out in its neighborhood. The place was a bit too ritzy even for its neighborhood of wealthy merchants. Evidently that's what centuries of Bifrong coffers and essentially revolutionizing bending did for your family though. Made them filthy rich. The only family that could really compete financially was the Satos, and Naruto kind of expected that given time the Satomobile would make the gap quite a bit larger. Settling onto the rooftop of the manor, he groaned as the sudden metallic embrace of shackles locked around his ankles. It seemed she was in a playful mood. At least she wasn't furious. He had been worried she might be waiting to ambush him as he made his way downstairs. Angry and playful also meant Naruto came up with a devious little plan, one that would mess with his father's head more than anything he could do himself. Should I be jealous? Lin's voice called out as she stepped into the roof from the stairway. Of who? My parents. He asked only to wince as the clamps on his feet tightened. Did you catch her or not? Lin asked. Well, yeah, but well I dunno if you will be mad or not. Naruto began. Let me guess. She's staying, right? The chief asked. Yeah, actually how did you know? Naruto asked. It was pretty easy to guess. If she hadn't, you and Tenzin would have fought and you would have come home and we would have done our usual post-Tenzin ritual. She said, a faint look of lust dancing in her eyes. Ugh, don't say it like that. That makes it sound like he makes us horny. Naruto said, grossed out. He just makes us angry. Being angry makes us aggressive and we are both very horny when we are aggressive. Lin corrected as she released him from her trap. Lime happened. After that, Naruto stepped away with a grin. He knew Lin better than anyone in the world and that little bout wasn't near enough to satisfy her. Slowly she came around and blinked in shock that he had left her without actually doing the deed. What the hell are you doing actually, what was all that? She asked as she could tell he had no intention of continuing at the moment. Well, consider it a taste for later tonight after you get back from meeting with the council. Naruto said with a grin. Why? She demanded but realized he wasn't about to answer that. Damn it, when does the meeting start? The extremely aroused woman asked. In a little less than an hour. You better hurry if you want to be cleaned up and down to City Hall in time. Naruto said before laughing as she ran to her bedroom to get dressed. With traffic this time of day she had no time to shower and would still barely make it in time. I am gonna break your damn pelvis tonight, smartus. Lin shouted as she kneaded her armor on and doused herself in perfume, hoping to smother the smell of her arousal. As Naruto watched her bolt out, he bit into a piece of fruit. It no doubt seemed random to her, but Naruto had plenty of his own reasons for doing as he had. The fact that he would be getting a round of extremely enjoyable angry sex from Lin that night was just a bonus for what he really wanted. He felt a bit guilty about using Lin like this, but when he explained it to Ait, the sex would just be all that more fun and he knew she would be getting a kick out of it after the fact. Naruto knew his father still had an attraction to the woman he had once been engaged to. Especially now that he had been with Naruto's mother so long and never had been with Lin. While he didn't know it was Naruto, the blonde had made sure that Tenzin was aware Lin had someone she saw romantically. He knew the old man was jealous without even knowing who it was. But the slightly enhanced sense of smell that came with reaching the level of an airbending master, Naruto knew that Tenzin would smell Lin throughout the entire meeting. Every time she moved the scent on her legs and coming from her beat would stir, and every time she spoke the smell of her juices on her breath would fill Tenzin's mind. Plus she was bound to be pissed so Tenzin could deal with that anger in his place. Tell the Avatar to avoid me, will you old bastard. I hope mom is still shutting you out from our argument. Naruto thought vindictively before deciding to clean up himself. He also needed to make something for when Lin got home and was hungry. He had no doubt she would figure out what he had done when she felt Tenzin's heart rate begin to fluctuate at the meeting. She was an excellent detective. Things went pretty much as Naruto had planned. Though, the level of anger his liver had to vent out had been severely underestimated and now both had slight limps from the night before. Still, the morning after and Lin was all smiles about messing with Tenzin's head even in this way. Both were wearing some of their nicest clothes, nicest robes on Naruto's part and dress uniform on Lin's. They both would be attending the press conference to be held in front of City Hall in the afternoon for Korra to make her proper introduction to the city. For some reason Lin had insisted Naruto invite Korra around Republic City to show her the city. She said that she doubted that the Avatar had gotten a chance to really see the sights while running from the police or being hauled to the island by Tenzin. Naruto had agreed but couldn't help the odd feeling he got. Lin seemed so pushy with him taking the girl around town that it reminded him of the night he had gone to see his family and the Avatar. She still wouldn't budge when he tried to get to the bottom of it though. The airbender pushed those thoughts from his mind as Korra stepped up to the pedestal to speak to the crowd gathered as well as over the radios that sat in practically every home in Republic City. Immediately she was stunned by the flashes of light as cameras went off in her face. The entire crowd shouting didn't help matters and practically every reporter in the city was in attendance. Every one of them calling out questions for Korra to answer. Demanding her attention. Even the brash and confident Avatar was taken aback by the attention. She hesitated only a moment before confronting it head-on. Naruto was getting a pretty good yes, I am definitely here to stay, I don't really have a plan yet. Korra awkwardly began, though in the face of hundreds of people, Naruto had to say it was with more confidence than practically anyone else could have. It was her first time talking in front of a crowd after all. All I know is that Avatar Aang meant for this city to be the center for peace and balance in the world. Her tone shifted as she found her verbal footing and began to more easily give her speech. But that the speech came to an end and the crowd slowly began to disperse. Lin stepped over to talk with the members of the council. Seeing his opportunity, Naruto stepped over to Korra and lightly tapped her shoulder to grab her attention. "Oh, Naruto, hi," she said, happy to see a somewhat familiar face after mobs of politicians and bureaucrats. "Hey. I gotta say you're a natural. First time talking in front of a big crowd like that and you nailed it," he complimented. "Thanks, I just kind of said what felt right," she said, blushing slightly under his praise. "I could tell. Honesty definitely was the best way to go. Everyone could feel you meant what you said." Naruto continued, causing the girl's blush to grow and her to awkwardly look away from the older boy. So I was wondering, since you haven't had a chance to actually see the city yet, maybe you would want to check out a few of the sights with me," he offered. The Avatar bit her lip and thought. Tenzin had pretty much ordered her not to be around Naruto, but from what she could tell he was actually pretty decent. Plus, she had such a peek at some of Genora's journals that had been in Naruto's room before Korra had moved in. It was clear Naruto wasn't some angsty dark criminal like Tenzin acted like he was. The fight between the two had made an impact on Korra though, and she didn't really want to be on Tenzin's bad side. "I dunno, Naruto," Korra said while looking away. "That's fine. It's an open offer, so feel free to look me up if you want a tour. I'm living at the Bifrong Manor house with Lin. They're most of the time too, or sometimes working out with some of the officers at the police headquarters." Naruto began to leave only to stop and turn back for a moment. "Oh, and if you wanted to check out pro bending or something, I have tickets to the match Friday night, so come by before then and we could go together." He then waved goodbye and walked off, greeting a couple people warmly as he passed by them. "Ugh, why didn't I just say yes?" Korra moaned to herself. "Because you were doing as I told you to. Avoid him, Korra, he has lost his path," Tenzin said from behind her, causing Korra to scrunch her face in frustration. "How can you say that about your own son? Plus I'm the Avatar. Helping put people on the right path is sorta what I'm supposed to be doing. I can't do that if I avoid them," Korra said hotly before storming off. "An ass as always, Tenzin," Lin said as she brushed past him in pursuit of Naruto. It seemed both of them had a free afternoon and evening now. She wondered if he would be interested in going out for dinner. She knew a discreet little place that didn't ask questions or spread rumors. It had been a little over a day since Korra gave her speech introducing herself to Republic City and thereby the world. Naruto had spent that time mostly with Lin, not actually doing anything his mother would disapprove of, which was somewhat of an oddity. Instead, they had mostly enjoyed a peaceful time on what more or less amounted to a date. Naruto had felt an odd gloom looming over the entire outing though. He had tried to maneuver the conversation with Lin to see if anything was bothering her, but she had simply reassured him she was doing perfectly fine. When he explained to her that he felt something was wrong, she deflected every attempt to dig deeper and instead she pushed things onto his recent uptick in interaction with his father. The airbender felt like that wasn't what the problem was, but with something so nebulous as having a feeling that something was off, he couldn't exactly deny that perhaps being around his father had affected his mood and perceptions. It didn't stop the niggling doubt in his mind that there was something else. Beyond that, it had been a nice time. A simple hearty meal and time spent together. Both of them were relatively easy to please individuals all things considered and didn't need a lot to keep them entertained. As with everything, the enjoyable atmosphere of a date night eventually came to a close and the pair had simply entangled themselves in bed and given in to sleep. Naruto, as embarrassed as it made him feel, found it hard to sleep. His desires had his body ready for repeat performances of the morning and nights that preceded it, but Lin was far too sore and tired to participate, so he had been left, frustrated in bed wrapped up with his lover. The following morning both were set to handle a busy day. They quickly showered, ate, brushed their teeth, and gave one another a parting peck before they went their separate ways. Lin rushed off in her Satomobile, dressed in her normal police uniform for the day. Naruto on the other hand clad himself in a somewhat unique bit of attire he'd had designed for the few days he actually needed to go into work. A blending of the popular black Gyeongsan-style suit and a series of orange and tan sashes that recalled his connection to the Air Nation. As if his tattoos didn't handle that already. Dressed in what he considered his business clothes, Naruto took the tram into the industrial section of the city. Several people bowed to him or greeted him warmly once they noticed the Air Nation clothing and marks. Even more so once they noticed the golden hair he possessed. It was something he had long gotten used to. Superstitions had long determined that the people of the Air Nation were considered far more spiritual than any other, and prior to their genocide, had been often asked to perform blessings on homes or individuals as they passed through. This same superstition had come back around, and even the acolytes who weren't airbenders themselves were frequently asked to perform blessings. None more than Naruto and Tenzin though. After all, they were both the only remaining airbending masters in the world. As Tenzin rarely came out through the city, Naruto had become a sort of go-to for the people of Republic City. That is, the more superstitious or spiritual. A few people who actually were a bit more connected to the spirit world would even comment on how odd Naruto felt to them. The usual words they said were that it was like he was cursed then twice blessed and born again. It was an oddly specific thing to say, and after the fifth person had told him those exact words, it had caused him to become a bit insecure about the spiritual aspect of his life. Sadly, there was little he could truly study about it. He found that the spirit world was especially difficult to interact with here in Republic City, and even outside of it, the best he could manage was glimpses and brief moments of euphoria. Nothing to really help him understand all that much about it all. His lack of success to truly embed himself into the spiritual realm was enough to cause him to shift focus over the years to the far more physical aspects of bending. Something he truly excelled in. The young airbending master smiled warmly, though part of him was a bit annoyed as a small family shoved their newborn into his arms. It looked he would be a little late. Maybe he should have just taken his glider over to his factory. At least he was doing his part to keep a warm public image with the populace. He wondered just what it was his father was up to right now. Hopefully doing his duty and training the Avatar. "And what is this little one's name?" Naruto asked the couple. "It's a girl, her name is Yuling." The mother said, a bit disappointed that Naruto hadn't realized it was a girl. Right. Well, let's perform a blessing for good health and good fortune for little Yuling here, shall we?" Naruto asked, calming the mother before she started asking questions. After all, while they were in fact more spiritual than the other nations, the air nomads didn't possess some sort of spirit magic. Each and every one of their blessings was bullshit, and they all knew it. The nation needed money though. Meanwhile, on the Airbender Island, Avatar Korra gasped for breath as she stared up at the sky from her position lying on the grass. This training really was no joke. It was killing her, and she was in amazing shape. How exactly was it the kids could do this? "Korra, come, try the gates again. I know you can do this," Tenzin urged. "Really? Cause I don't feel like I am making any progress," Korra complained as she stood and dusted herself off. "The gates aren't an easy obstacle, but they build the foundation of airbending. You have to move in circular motions and flow with and around your obstacles to reach the other side," Tenzin said before nodding to Jinora, who quickly made her own way through the spinning boards without being so much as grazed by them as she did so. Korra had to admit the younger girl was extremely talented with airbending. She had told her as much before, but the girl had given her an odd smile and said she had seen nothing yet. That made her ask what she could really do, but Jinora had simply told her she hadn't meant herself. Korra had a suspicion she was talking about Tenzin and Naruto. She'd only seen the two of them using their airbending for small everyday things, but after thinking about it, the precision and ease both men wielded their elements was something she realized she hadn't seen outside of Katara with water back home. "Korra, give it another try," Tenzin said as he sent the gate spinning. "Right," the young Avatar replied with a lack of enthusiasm. She had to say that Tenzin wasn't exactly a slave driver like some of her teachers had been, but he was demanding. At least he seemed rather patient, all things considered. The mildly disappointed look every time she failed one of his exercises didn't really help though. After winding up in the same position as last attempt, except perhaps 3 feet to the right from where she landed last time, Korra decided she wanted to weasel a break out of her teacher. A perfect opportunity to weasel other things as well, like some information. After all, she knew a lot about Tenzin and the kids, but there was one airbender she knew nothing about. What better way than to feed into Tenzin's own issues around him to get him talking? With an only partially hidden smirk, Korra pushed herself to her feet and dusted herself off before approaching the starting point for the obstacle course once again. Milo was taking a turn running through the gates at a noticeably slower pace than Jinora had earlier. It was a bit annoying that the boy at most brushed against 1 or 2 boards as he glided through. Korra just turned her attention back on Tenzin and ignored the fact that the 8-year-old was technically doing better than she was. "So, Tenzin, did you have any trouble with this when you were learning?" Korra asked. Well, yes, I suppose, though I was a bit younger than you when I trained with them. However, my only element was air, so I had a bit of an advantage over you. Not to mention, I can't help but think your personality will make air your most difficult element," Tenzin said, trying to skirt the fact he had been running through the gates at the same speed as Jinora, but at Milo's age. "Oh, well, what about Naruto? He must have sucked, right? You said he was a shame on airbending or whatever, right?" Korra prodded, though she did notice Jinora seemed to clench her fists at Korra's words. She'd need to tell her she hadn't meant it as trying to belittle the guy later. Jinora didn't seem happy if he was spoken of in a bad light. "No, I never said that. Don't get me wrong, Korra. Naruto is a genius when it comes to airbending. The issue isn't his skill, it's his mentality and morality." The man's tone turned darker as he spoke. "Naruto is reckless, brash, and careless of the consequences of his actions. Added along with the fact that he perverted the art of bending even more than those thugs in the pro bending tournaments do, he never should have received the tattoos of a master." Korra was a bit taken back by the man's words, and again Korra noticed the upset look on Jinora's face. Thankfully during the conversation Ikki had taken her turn on the gates, and both she and Milo had been out of earshot for their father's rather grim tone regarding their elder brother. "Korra, why don't you try the gates again?" Tenzin asked, clearly done with the conversation. Korra mentally kicked herself for her curiosity as she proceeded to be beaten down by the spinning boards once again. Yet again she was spit out and crashed onto the ground staring up at the sky. This was miserable. Naruto arrived at his factory a bit later than he wanted and saw that his workers were all already busy as they could be. He was a bit disappointed with himself as he liked to greet them at the gates on the days that he visited so that he could show his employees they really were valued members of his business. It wasn't that big of a deal, he supposed. Those that could happily waved at their boss and Naruto responded in kind. It was surreal having such a large factory and so many employees. He had over 300 people on his payroll after all, and he was successful entirely without his family's or more specifically his father's support. He hadn't done it entirely alone. Lin had lent him some startup money and had introduced him to Hiroshi Sato and several other influential people not only in Republic City but within the Earth Kingdom as well, who became his investors. Lin had been paid back in full with interest, despite her protests, and Hiroshi and the other investors had all slowly sold their pieces of his company back to him. Naruto had then given small amounts of stock to his employees as a bonus once the company had recouped the costs it took to build his factory. As it was now, the majority of the company was solidly in Naruto's control, while Lin owned a small portion. His mother and siblings each owned an even smaller portion, though none knew that besides Naruto himself, and lastly Hiroshi Sato owned a piece of the company only slightly larger than Naruto's 20 foremen combined. That all ended up meaning that Naruto was excessively wealthy despite his primarily frugal lifestyle. After all, he kept almost all the profits his company produced, even if he did reinvest the vast majority right back into the company itself. With things as they were, his factory was making money hand over fist. It turned out, everyone wanted glass. Especially his glass. Not only did his company make the most clear and flawless panes in the world, they also produced nearly a dozen various types of glass. The flagship item being the specially tempered glass Naruto had invented himself that was found in every single Sato mobile produced. In fact, that was the only reason Hiroshi still had a piece in Naruto's glass company. It was part of their contract for Naruto becoming the sole producer of the glass used by the vehicle factory. Naruto smiled once more as he began climbing the stairs up from the factory floor up to the offices above. He was proud of his business. He had truly built it up from nothing. Originally it had been something to make a bit of money on the side, so he didn't feel like so much of a burden to Lin. He found he could use his airbending to blow glass sculptures, which became vases and other household items, before eventually becoming windows and mirrors. It wasn't long before he was receiving more orders than he could fill and had to begin streamlining the process, so his own involvement was limited so that he could hire people to do the rest of the work. By now he wasn't a part of the actual production process at all. Another part of his contract with Hiroshi had been for the man to help in designing and producing equipment that made it to where even non-benders could make his company's product without issue. Now Naruto employed both benders and non-benders as equally as possible. Nothing in his job required anything skill-wise that couldn't be eventually learned or developed by practically everyone. That had thrilled him as much as it had worried him. Naruto was a public supporter of equality for benders and non-benders. In fact, he was partially responsible for much of the city remaining solidly in the moderate camp when it came to the issues between the equalists and the traditionalists. There was a definite issue between benders and non-benders that needed addressed, but Naruto and many others could see Amon and his followers for what they were: terrorists. While Naruto supported equality for benders and non-benders, it was easy when your own mother was a non-bender after all. It worried him to see how easy it was to replace himself with technology. The leading argument most traditionalists made against their equalist rivals was the importance of bending in society. It was a hard argument to deny at the moment as well. Naruto knew that more than 60% of all of Republic City's electric power was generated by firebenders feeding lightning. They had bent into conduits that transferred it into what amounted to giant batteries. Some electricity was produced by other means, but altogether they made up less than 40% of the city's power, and that was in Republic City, the most technologically advanced place on the planet. Electricity was just one example. Water purification, construction, medical procedures, all were still dominated by benders and for good reason. That was what made it such a compelling argument for the traditionalist side of the coin. That same thinking was part of the problem though. There were still needs for firebenders, waterbenders, and earthbenders in this more peaceful time. Technology had failed to fully replace them, yet anyway. That left airbenders though. What exactly could his people, his family, offer besides some spiritual support that he himself was more to do with the majority of the world, not knowing hardly anything about them? How long would that last? The truth remained they didn't provide anything, so if the rest of the world came to see them as useless, or worse yet some sort of leech on society. The fear at what would be done against the tiny air nation then filled him with worry for his loved ones. The airbender frowned deeply as he turned back to look over the factory as his workers toiled away. Any trace of the good mood he had been carrying with him that morning was gone now. Thoughts of what if and when and how always seemed to sour his day when he let his mind drift to it. One thing typically picked it up though, and that was his younger siblings. Plus, perhaps Korra had made her decision to join or refuse his offer to see the city and join him for the upcoming pro-bending match. Literally nothing for me to do here. The company is running as smoothly as always. Naruto thought out loud as he smiled slightly. He was thankful to have such a dedicated staff at the least. The trip back to Lin's house to change into more comfortable clothing and grab his glider was quicker thankfully, and the trip out to the island was even faster. After all, there wasn't much out there that could travel faster than an airbender. That thought began to spin ideas in his mind, though he put them aside for now. As it was, he was trying to relax and improve his mood. Thinking hard on something like air transport was just going to annoy him. Especially considering there were already airships, so he would need to think of a way to make his method competitive along with safe. Ah, stop it. He growled to himself as he vigorously shook his head. His thoughts were running free again, and he wanted to rein them in and relax. He had to remind himself that mentally a couple more times before it properly settled in. Well, it would have, except he thankfully had a distraction as he silently landed and made his way around the compound, hoping to catch the others still on the training grounds. He caught them alright, in fact he seemed to feel an instinctive need to duck around the corner to avoid being spotted as he saw Korra pulling Jinora to the side to talk. She looked rather serious too, so he couldn't help his curiosity in exactly what it was they had to talk about. Naruto felt a bit dirty for eavesdropping, but whether it was curiosity or the protective nature of an elder brother, he wanted to hear whatever it was Korra had to say to his little sister in private. Jinora, when your dad was talking earlier while we were training you got upset. Do you want to talk about it? Korra asked while gently laying a hand on the younger girl's shoulder. Naruto blinked in surprise from his hiding spot. Surprise quickly shifted to happiness. It was kind of Korra to be trying to help his sister. He relaxed at that. He had the feeling Korra was a kind soul if a bit brash and headstrong. He remained hidden though. Hopefully Korra could help his sister through whatever had bothered her. Oh, no, I'm fine really. Jinora attempted to wave Korra off. It didn't work in the slightest. Look, I know when he says that sort of thing about your brother it bothers you. I mean, saying something like he did earlier today makes Naruto out to be some sort of violent thug. Korra rambled slightly, managing to press the airbender's buttons. He's not a thug. She interrupted the older girl. Korra was shocked by the outburst for a second, as was Naruto from his hiding spot. Korra took in Jinora's appearance and was further surprised by the furious look on her face, as well as the tightly clenched fists that shook slight at her sides. Oh, I wasn't trying to say that I thought he was a thug. Every time I've talked to him he's been nothing but kind and friendly. Korra reassured her friend. That's because that's what he is. Dad is just so set on his course and stubborn he refuses to look at things from Naruto's side of things. I don't really know the whole story, but he's always been harder on Naruto. It got worse just a little before Naruto earned his tattoos. Jinora admitted, piquing Korra's curiosity even more. In hiding, Naruto flinched, recalling what Jinora was building up to. What do you mean? The Avatar asked. Jinora squirmed slightly as she debated on whether or not to tell Korra. Slowly she decided she had best tell her everything. Korra was pretty much family and she was the Avatar after all. It was around a year before Naruto earned his tattoos and moved out. Naruto had been ready for the master trial for some time, but Dad kept making excuses and pushing it off, saying that Naruto wasn't ready. Jinora began unknowingly sending her big brother into a flashback of his own. Flashback? A 13-year-old Naruto swept into his Spartan room and slapped his staff onto his desk with a bit more force than was necessary. The boy paid it no mind though as he dropped into his bed with an agitated groan. Yet again his father had denied Naruto his right to the master trials. Instead he had forced him to meditate for hours on end to supposedly teach him patience. Afterward he'd been so frustrated that he knew attending dinner with the rest of the family was a bad idea. It would start with one of his little sisters asking why he was being quiet, which would turn into a scolding from his father about brooding. Naruto knew himself too well, the moment such words would have come out of his father's mouth, he would have said something just to get on the man's nerves. It would spiral till his mother and sisters were upset and crying, and his father was purple in the face from shouting at him. It had been like that for a couple months now and only seemed to be getting worse. It was better he had just decided to train rather than go to dinner. He didn't want to fight and make the girls cry again. As it was though the thoughts about his father's continued refusal to allow his advancement and the fact he seemed to work against him at every turn hadn't faded away during training like he had hoped. If anything, by the time he returned to his room, his tired aching body and rumbling empty stomach just made his resentment that much worse. The boy could do little other than try and calm down and get some sleep. He was tired after all. As he rolled over and looked across his room preparing to count sheep and try and force himself into sleep like he needed to, he noticed a paper that had fallen under the chair of his desk. Sighing and realizing he was likely too restless to sleep anyway, Naruto climbed out of bed and swept the paper up with a gentle gust of wind. Naruto couldn't stop the soft smile that crept onto his features. Jinora had developed a habit of coming into his room to draw or try and get Naruto to play. It seemed like even if he wasn't here she liked to be in his room. He stepped out into the hall and began walking down to his sister's room, only to freeze at the sight before him. 3 people in dark clothes and masks were stepping out of Jinora and Ikki's rooms, with the unconscious girls tied up and securely held within their arms. The boy's mind raced at the sight and he felt the oncoming rush of panic, but rather than succumb to it, his eyes zeroes in on the tear streaks on his little sister's faces and a sense of rage crushed any feeling of fear or panic entirely. He'd never felt so angry. So full of hatred, like every single cell of his being howled for the blood of these trespassers kidnapping his family members. He didn't realize he was bending till the first of the trespassers screamed in pain. He didn't stop at the sound though. If anything, it egged him on. It felt as if something was guiding his movements, all the while whispering into his ear about how he needed to make them pay. He had to make them scream for mercy before he finished them off. It was only right, they were harming his little sisters. Regaining control of himself, Naruto gasped at the carnage he had wrought. The screaming of the first man had stopped because he was undoubtedly dead. Deep troughs had been carved through his chest and head and his body laid motionless on the floor. The second though was screaming. This time a woman, she howled in a way Naruto didn't realize was possible. Her legs sat on the floor several feet away from her torso and her hands worked uselessly to try and stem the stream of blood and gore that emptied from the gaping wound where her lower half had previously been. The third man stared in horror before slowly turning and locking eyes with Naruto. The two stared at one another as the woman's pain-filled howls swiftly died away to a croak and then silence as she bled out. The two continued to stare at one another until the distant sound of the airbender compound coming to life to find the source of the disturbance echoed up the halls. As the final man's eyes shifted ever so briefly to Jinora, who was now awake and sobbing into her gag, Naruto didn't hesitate. This time he was fully in control of his movements and actions as he blasted the man into the far end of the hall directly in front of his father and several armed acolytes as they approached. It didn't take long for them to capture the man after all of that, but the group became horrified when they approached the children. By then, Naruto had freed both Jinora and Ikki, and while Ikki had been unconscious throughout the entire ordeal, Jinora clung to Naruto for dear life. That is until both girls were ripped from his grasp by Tenzin, who glared down at his son with a mixture of disgust and fear. Naruto himself flinched from the look, but Tenzin's eyes never softened, if anything they darkened further, and he left Naruto sitting there, splattered with blood of 2 adults he had just killed, while the acolytes did their best to attend to him. Then flashback. He killed them. Korra's voice drew Naruto back out of his memories as his attention returned to the 2 girls talking. Jinora looked exceedingly agitated by Korra's reaction. He had no choice. It wasn't his fault. I wasn't trying to say it was, Korra tried to argue, but Jinora cut her off. But you were jumping to conclusions. Naruto saved me and Ikki. I don't know who those people are, but I found out a year ago why they were taking us. They wanted to take us and Milo to use us, and Jinora couldn't finish that line of thought. It was vile and terrifying. Korra tried to comfort the younger teen. How do you think most 13-year-olds handle accidentally killing someone in defense? Not well, but usually they have someone to comfort them. Naruto didn't. A month after it happened and he hardly spoke or ate. Then he started staying at the Beifrong Manor with Lin. Dad has treated him like a monster and mom is always busy with Ikki or Milo. Then he got his tattoos a few months later after going around my dad entirely and having the elder acolytes run the exam for him. He moved out right after. Jinora explained as she released a sigh, like a sizable weight had been lifted from her shoulders. The pair was silent for a while as Korra seemed to process everything. She wanted to help this family mend, but she was even more lost on how to help them along now than she was before she knew the full reasoning behind their split. She had begun to quickly learn that being the Avatar was quite a lot more complicated than she had initially thought. Silently, Naruto frowned at the interaction. He wasn't thrilled about how much his issues with his father affected the rest of the family, but he couldn't bring himself to deny his own beliefs just to please Tenzin. Shaking his head in frustration at the situation his family found themselves in, he quietly slipped away and took off again, only to make a show of landing in the courtyard opposite of the training grounds. It wouldn't do anything but hurt the trust Jinora had in him if she knew he had been eavesdropping. "Naruto." Ikki squealed before shooting out of the building and impacting her big brother in the chest and tightly hugging him. "Ikki." Naruto replied as he hugged the girl, chuckling all the while. "I didn't know you were coming over," Ikki said excitedly. "Yeah, I probably should have given mom a heads up. Hopefully there's enough food at dinner," Naruto said awkwardly. "Oh, mom always makes enough in case you come by. She even sets your place at the table and everything," Ikki replied. Naruto bit his lip at that information. Guilt gnawed at his heart at the thought of his mother always being disappointed about him not being there to eat with the family. As usual, his problems with his father affected the family more than it did themselves. That was of course ignoring all the troubles Naruto himself suffered through due to the ongoing fight. In fact, the only one that seemed altogether unscathed emotionally was Tenzin. "Well, let's get in there. I gotta say I'm starved," Naruto said with false cheer as he picked Ikki off of him and set her onto his shoulders, getting the thin girl to giggle. They headed up the stairs to the central building to catch up with the rest of the family and hopefully enjoy a peaceful dinner. Thankfully, whatever Pima had done to punish Tenzin for his previous argument with Naruto at dinner had set the man into a much quieter disposition this time around. That being said, the sense of annoyance and agitation practically wafted off of the man. Most of the table were either oblivious or ignored him though. Naruto took time to learn about everyone's day one by one. His mother had begun to have a bit of trouble getting around as she was close to popping. The acolytes had been overly helpful as always, making her feel useless, which she complained about, getting snorts of humor from most of the table, especially Naruto and Korra. Ikki and Milo had filled him in on every moment of their daily training and playing, and Ikki had recruited him to play house the next day, which he was already dreading slightly. That didn't mean he could bring himself to turn down the request though. His little siblings were all way too good at that pouty look. It just wasn't fair. Jinora had been a bit awkward. He noticed she carefully avoided anything about the discussion he had overheard. That was good, he didn't really want to discuss that, preferably ever. Sadly, just by the way Korra had been staring at Naruto over the course of the meal, he knew she would be bringing it up at some point. Hopefully not during the meal. He decided to preempt her stumbling into that horrible conversation topic by taking the lead himself. "So, Korra, how is training going?" Naruto asked. The girl blinked for a moment before realizing he was asking her a question. "Oh well, not great I guess." "Really? That's surprising, I thought you would have been killing it," Naruto said thoughtfully. He shared a look with Tenzin. Surprisingly, neither glared at one another. Instead, their similar drive toward excellence in bending had them both more focused on solving the problem of helping a new student learn the style. "Well, what have you been working on?" Naruto asked. "The gates, not that I really get why they are called gates. Should have called it spinning walls or something so that it's more honest," Korra said as she childishly crossed her arms and pouted. "Well, they are gates cause you are supposed to through them like gates, Korra," Tenzin said with a sigh. The young avatar seemed to only pout harder. Naruto took pity on her and drew everyone's attention as he hummed loudly and thought. "Well, I can't give much help. I would say when it comes to the gates, the whole exercise is about your foundations. It's your footwork. Focus on that and remember that airbending is based around spiral movements and you should make progress," Naruto said. "Footwork, alright, that seems easy enough, I'll try that," Korra chirped as she rubbed her chin and thought. "The large part of this exercise is figuring those things out for yourself," Tenzin grumbled. "Well, I'm sure she can figure it out for herself now that she knows what it is you want from her," Naruto replied. Tenzin opened his mouth to respond, but the sudden gripping of his hand by Pima had his teeth click as his jaw snapped closed. The meal continued in relative peace before Naruto promised to return the next day and took off back to the Bifrone Manor. Ikki reminded him as he left that he did promise her. End chapter. So this part ends here. If you want to see next part of this series, like the video now and share the story with your friends. Bye bye.